I remember the way the room went quiet. It wasn't a holy silence like the kind that happens in church when sunlight breaks through the stained glass. No, this was the heavy, awkward kind, the silence that makes people shift in their seats, tug at their collars, and whisper behind cupped hands. The silence followed my father. He had just walked into my sister's wedding wearing a faded suit from another decade and a pair of shoes with cracks along the leather. One of them split near the toe. You could see the rough edges, the wear of years. They squeaked faintly with each step, and every squeak was like an announcement: I don't belong here. Now, weddings are supposed to be about joy. Champagne glasses, nervous laughter, people asking, "How did you two meet?" But on that day you could almost taste the judgment in the air. Some tilted their heads with pity, others smirked. A few relatives from my stepmother's side muttered, not even trying to hide it, "Look at him. Doesn't he own anything better? Those shoes, they are embarrassing." I saw it all. I heard it all, and so did he. My father, once a man who commanded respect in every room, didn't defend himself. He didn't explain that he still had money in the bank, that he had once built a business from nothing, that he could have shown up in a brand new tailored suit if he wanted to. Instead, he smiled. A small, tired smile. It was the kind of smile you wear when you've already made peace with people misunderstanding you. I'll admit, I felt ashamed that day. Not of him, never of him, but ashamed of how quickly people judged the man who had given everything so that his children could stand taller. You see, when we were young, he was the one who worked late nights, missing dinners, his hands cracked from labor. He was the one who slipped folded 20s into our lunchboxes even when the bills piled high. He was the one who took out a second mortgage so I could go to college, and who quietly sold his prized fishing boat to pay my sister's tuition when scholarships fell short. We never knew, not really, what he gave up. We only saw the results: a roof over our heads, diplomas in our hands, the life he never got to live for himself. And yet here he was, at a wedding meant to celebrate love and family, standing in shoes that made him look like a stranger in his own story. The photographer didn't even want him in the first round of family pictures. My stepmother, elegant in her pearl necklace, tried to steer him to the edge of the group, as if the torn leather might stain the memory forever captured on glossy paper. I caught the flicker in his eyes then, a glimmer of hurt quickly buried. He adjusted his tie, which was frayed at the edges, and took his place at the corner. No one clapped when he walked in. No one said, "There he is, the father of the bride." The man who had sacrificed everything for us had suddenly become invisible. But here's what no one knew. Those shoes, those cracked soles, he chose them, deliberately. My father was testing something that day. Not the durability of leather, but the durability of love. Would people still respect him without the polished armor of wealth? Would the vows of marriage, the promises of family, mean anything if the man who carried them looked poor? It was, in a way, his quiet experiment. Later that night, as I watched him sip water instead of wine, alone at the edge of the reception hall, I understood something. Love isn't proven when you're dressed in your best. Love is proven when the world thinks you're at your worst, and the people who truly care stay. My father was searching for that truth. Maybe it was for himself. Maybe it was for us, his children. Or maybe it was for the grandchildren he hadn't yet met, to know that the inheritance of love is stronger than the inheritance of money. I wish I could tell you that everyone passed his test, that my stepmother wrapped her arm around him, that guests saw through the scuffed shoes to the man who had walked 1,000 miles for his family. But that's not what happened. Instead, they laughed, they whispered, they dismissed him. And in that dismissal, my father found his answer. When I think back on that day, it isn't the vows or the bouquet or the music that lingers in my mind. It's my father walking into a room full of judgment, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a man who no longer needed to prove anything except to himself. And though no one else clapped, I did, quietly, inside my heart, because I knew torn shoes don't make a man small, but sometimes they make the truth visible. If the silence marked his entrance, then the whispers carried the weight of the evening. They rose slowly, like steam curling from hot plates, invisible but impossible to ignore. A murmur here, a chuckle there, a sharp intake of breath smothered behind a manicured hand. Soon they stitched themselves into the fabric of the wedding hall, weaving a pattern of judgment that clung to every corner. The chandeliers above glowed with a golden warmth, but the words below were anything but warm. At the table nearest the bar, I heard an aunt from my stepmother's family lean in, her perfume, a heavy floral scent mixing with the sweetness of champagne. She said, "He could have at least shined them. A father of the bride in shoes like that." Her companion laughed softly, the sound like silverware clinking against porcelain. Across the room, two cousins in tailored suits shook their heads. "Guess the old man's broke." One whispered as though the music from the string quartet could hide his words. It couldn't. The quartet was playing Vivaldi, bright and brisk, but no melody could soften the sting of mockery. My father stood near the refreshment table then, lifting a glass of water. The ice cubes clinked faintly, a fragile sound compared to the laughter around him. He sipped slowly as if the water had the power to anchor him. I watched his shoulders. They did not slump. He held them square, though the whispers brushed against his back like cold drafts sneaking in through a cracked window. When he moved through the crowd, the air seemed to shift. Some people stepped aside too quickly as though avoiding contact. Others offered smiles too sharp, too polished, the kind that ended at the lips and never reached the eyes. He nodded politely, always polite, always measured. His presence was quiet but steady, a calm stone in a river of voices rushing past. Still, the whispers followed him. I caught fragments that evening, each one like a needle. Why would she marry him anyway? She could do better. Maybe he's after her money, or maybe she's after his. Hard to tell. Look at him, standing there like he owns the place. The words piled up, uninvited guests at the celebration. And then came the cruelest one, spoken not with malice but with casual indifference which somehow cut deeper. "He looks tired, doesn't he? Old men always do, they fade. Fade." The word lingered, not shouted, not meant for him to hear, but I knew he felt it. Words don't need volume to wound. They only need intention. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic butter drifted through the hall. Plates clattered as servers wove between tables. Laughter erupted from the younger guests near the dance floor. Life in all its noise and fragrance pressed forward, ignoring the quiet humiliation playing out at the edges. My father remained still, almost blending into the wallpaper with its muted cream tones and gilded borders. But his eyes, they traveled. They saw everything. And though his mouth curved faintly at times, his gaze carried a weight, a silent accounting of who watched, who whispered, who looked away. At one point, I slipped beside him. He didn't turn, just kept staring at the dance floor where my sister twirled in her gown, her veil catching the light like a wisp of smoke. "Are you all right?" I asked softly. His answer was a whisper of his own, but not one meant to wound. "I've been all right for longer than you know." He said no more. The band shifted to a slower tune, violins sighing as if echoing the fatigue in his voice. What I didn't realize then, what none of us did, was that every whisper was serving a purpose. Every side glance, every muffled laugh, every dismissive gesture was part of a silent tally he was keeping. He was learning. He was learning who respected the man and who respected only the shoes, who could see past appearances and who was blinded by them. The night carried on. Glasses refilled, cake was served, speeches stumbled between sentiment and comedy, and through it all the whispers never quite stopped. They thinned, thickened, shifted rooms, but they clung to the air like the faint scent of smoke after a candle is snuffed. When my father finally stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, the cold evening greeted him with a sharper honesty than anything inside. The night smelled of damp grass and autumn leaves. He inhaled deeply, as if to clear away the residue of words. And when he returned, there was a calmness about him, as if he had made peace with the whispers. Or perhaps, as I would later learn, he had simply decided what to do with them. The whispers that trailed him inside the wedding hall didn't just bruise the present. They opened a door to the past, a past most of those voices had never known or had chosen to forget. For me, memories returned in fragments, vivid as if etched into my skin. The sound of a screen door slamming shut on summer nights. The scent of motor oil clinging to his hands when he came home from the garage. The way his shoulders carried the weight of tools, groceries, and, somehow, all of us at once. But none of that was visible to the guests tonight. To them he was only an old man in worn shoes. I remembered a winter long ago when snow piled high against our front steps. The furnace had broken and the house rattled with cold. My breath puffed white in the bedroom air, but in the middle of the night I heard the scrape of metal and the hiss of flame. Down in the basement my father had rigged a heater with little more than wire, grit, and sheer will. He sat beside it, shivering in his coat, keeping watch so we could sleep warm. The next morning I woke to the smell of oatmeal simmering, though I knew he hadn't eaten the night before. No one in the wedding hall remembered that man. There was also the summer he built us a swing in the backyard. Lumber was expensive, so he salvaged planks from a neighbor's discarded deck. I watched him hammer under the harsh sun, sweat running into his eyes, shirt sticking to his back. When the swing was finished, it wasn't polished or store-bought. The wood was rough, the chains mismatched, but when we climbed on, it held. It always held. That was my father making sure we could fly, even if his own hands blistered in the process. Yet tonight, as laughter floated over tablecloths and crystal glasses, none of it was spoken. No toast carried his name. He had been invisible in other ways too, not through neglect but through choice. I remembered opening envelopes with college acceptance letters, the embossed seals shining in the light. My father would stand in the doorway, his smile faint but steady, as though he had been waiting for that moment longer than we had. We didn't know then that he had been meeting with bankers in quiet offices, arranging loans, pushing deadlines. He never said a word about the arguments he endured, the signatures he scrawled with trembling hands. He only said, "Go, study, do better than I did." Now, years later at my sister's wedding, those sacrifices had faded like photographs left too long in the sun. A cousin raised his glass that evening, voice loud, praising the family's new beginnings. He spoke of ambition, beauty, and fresh starts. Everyone applauded. My father clapped too, his palms meeting slowly, rhythm steady. But I saw his gaze drop to the floor, as if the applause itself reminded him of all the moments that had gone unnoticed. The parquet beneath our feet gleamed under the chandeliers, but I imagined him walking across the old hardwood floors of our childhood home, carrying groceries in plastic bags that cut into his fingers. No one applauded then. No one thanked him for those small victories that kept us whole. I glanced around the hall. The air carried the scent of roses from the centerpieces, mingling with wine and buttercream from the towering cake. Guests leaned in, laughing over half-remembered stories. None of those stories included the night he carried me feverish through the emergency room doors, his breath ragged from running. None included the afternoons he stood alone at baseball games, cheering louder than anyone, his voice cracking from pride. Those memories belonged to him, to us, but not to the people who now measured him by the shine of his shoes. As he sat at the edge of the hall, his chair angled slightly away from the main table, I wondered if he felt the erasure as keenly as I did. His hands rested on his knees, fingers lined with age but steady, as if still ready to build, to repair, to hold. His eyes followed the bride, his daughter, across the room. She laughed, veil swaying as she leaned into her new husband's arm. The band played another waltz. No one noticed the man in the corner, but I remembered. I remembered the smell of sawdust in our garage, the echo of his footsteps on long nights, the way his presence filled the gaps where life might have broken us. And though the past seemed forgotten in that hall, it lived quietly, beating steady in my chest. What the guests at the wedding never saw, what they could not have imagined, was that the man in the frayed suit with shoes splitting at the seams held more security in his name than most of them would ever touch in a lifetime. It was not obvious. He made sure of that. To the world, he appeared like a man scraping by, leaning on modest pensions, counting bills at the grocery store. But tucked away in neat folders in a fireproof safe, and in accounts spread carefully across institutions, lay the quiet record of a life built on sacrifice and restraint. Years ago, before my sister's veil ever touched her shoulders, my father had sold the business he built with his hands. A small company, repair work, construction, odd jobs that grew into contracts and steady revenue. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and he poured into it the same stubborn diligence he gave to his family. The day the sale went through, I remembered the ink staining his thumb from the papers he signed. He came home, washed his hands in the sink, and cooked himself eggs as though nothing monumental had happened. No champagne, no announcement, just eggs and toast. When I asked what he would do with the money, he smiled faintly. Take care of the ones who need taking care of. That was all he said. Over time, he made quiet choices that no one noticed. A house bought in cash, its mortgage never known to us. A college fund opened in our names, accruing interest even when we had no idea it existed. Bonds tucked away, maturing quietly while he lived simply, eating soup and bread for dinner. He invested not in extravagance but in security. His version of love was compound interest, modest dividends, and the safety of knowing his children would never be cornered by the world the way he once had been. And yet, at this wedding, surrounded by lace and laughter, no one saw him as the man who had outsmarted hunger and debt. They saw only the scuffs on his shoes. He wanted it that way. This was not accident. This was design. The worn suit, the old shoes, the quiet manners, all part of the veil he wore. He understood something that others did not. Wealth reveals, but it also corrupts. He had lived long enough to know that when people can smell money, their love begins to change shape. And he wanted to know, truly know, if the woman who stood at his side in pearls loved the man or the fortune. So he kept his secret. I sometimes imagine him alone at night, sitting at the kitchen table, light pooling from a single bulb above, bank statements spread out before him. The smell of ink, the faint scratch of pen against paper as he signed another renewal, another transfer. He would pause, sip coffee that had long since gone lukewarm, and think of us, his children, his grandchildren yet unborn. Not once did he calculate vacations to faraway beaches or flashy cars. His math was different. It was built on tuition bills, hospital costs, the down payment for a future home we hadn't even dreamed of yet. That was his empire, not luxury but safety. I remember once, years before the wedding, catching him in that quiet ritual, papers spread, calculator in hand. His face was serious, not with greed but with purpose. "Dad," I asked, "why do you always look so worried when you're the one who has money saved?" He looked at me for a long time, eyes steady, voice low. "Because money isn't what you keep, it's what you protect." I didn't fully understand then, but sitting in that hall watching guests dismiss him, I realized he was still protecting, not his pride, not his reputation, but us. He knew the whispers would come. He knew the humiliation would sting. Yet he accepted it the way a soldier accepts scars, because if the disguise worked, if the world believed he was nothing but an aging man with nothing left to give, then the fortune remained safe, untouched by hands that didn't deserve it. The secret was not a burden to him. It was a shield, and behind that shield he carried a quiet defiance. The laughter at his expense, the sidelong glances, the unspoken pity, they were all part of a game only he knew he was playing. And when the time came, the ones who had whispered would learn that the man they dismissed had been holding more than money. He had been holding judgment. The chandeliers glittered above us that night. The music swelled. The guests toasted and dined. And my father, sitting in the corner with his worn shoes and calm eyes, guarded a fortune no one else could see, an inheritance measured not just in dollars, but in the fierce determination to give without being seen, to love without being thanked, to protect without being asked. Dinner was being served when the moment arrived. Servers in crisp black vests moved like clockwork, balancing trays heavy with roasted duck and glazed carrots, plates lined with sauces painted in elegant swirls. The scent of rosemary and butter drifted through the room, mixing with the faint tang of champagne. At the center of it all stood the head table, draped in ivory linen, trimmed with gold thread, lit by tall candles that shimmered against crystal glasses. That table was for the bride and groom, for their parents, for the closest circle. My father started toward it, his steps measured, hands folded in front of him as though he was careful not to disturb anyone. His place had always been clear, hadn't it? A father belonged beside his daughter on her wedding day. But as he reached the empty chair near the bride, my stepmother's hand darted out. Her nails, painted a deep red, tapped sharply against the chair's back, a sound like a gavel. "You can't sit here," she said, her voice pitched low but edged with steel. The words did not ring loud across the hall. They didn't need to. The proximity of the guests, the sudden hush of forks pausing midair, carried them farther than she might have intended. A cousin turned his head. A bridesmaid blinked, her smile faltering. Someone at the far end stifled a laugh behind a napkin. My father stood still, his hand hovering above the chair. His face did not harden, nor did it break. He simply looked at her, eyes steady, mouth closed, as though weighing whether silence might preserve him more than speech. "You don't belong at this table," she repeated, softer this time, but with finality. The words hung between them like smoke. The candles flickered, their flames bending as if stirred by the sudden tension. My father lowered his hand, then straightened, spine rigid but not defensive. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then stepped back. He did not argue, he did not plead. He did not remind her or anyone else that without him there would be no wedding at all, no tuition paid, no roof over the head where the bride had grown up. He simply walked away. The scrape of his chair being pulled aside was louder than the quartet playing in the background. It screeched faintly across the polished floor, a sound that made me wince. He moved toward a smaller table near the back, one half filled with distant relatives and guests who barely knew him. The linen there was creased, the candles shorter, the wine poured later. It was not a table of honor. It was a table of convenience. He sat without complaint, adjusting his napkin onto his lap, fingers deliberate, movements careful, as though by treating the moment with dignity he could hold onto some piece of it. I felt my stomach twist. Rage rose in me, thick and bitter, but I could not move. My sister, radiant in her gown, had not noticed. She was laughing with her husband as the toasts began. Around them, clinking glasses filled the air with hollow cheer. Yet I knew my father had noticed. Of course he had. Every muscle in his jaw was still, too still. His eyes were fixed on the plate before him, but he did not eat. At the smaller table, conversation stumbled awkwardly. A woman beside him shifted in her chair, offering a half-hearted smile, as if unsure whether to acknowledge the insult he had just endured. Another guest poured wine into his glass, hands fumbling, their kindness laced with pity. But my father lifted the glass steadily, nodded in thanks, and sipped. His throat moved slowly, deliberately, as though swallowing not just the wine but the humiliation that came with it. The speeches rolled on. My stepmother raised her glass, voice strong, praising her daughter, praising love, praising new beginnings. Applause thundered around the hall. My father clapped too, softly. Palms against palms, sound muted. He clapped because that was what was expected. But his eyes never left the table from which he had been turned away. I watched him from across the room, and I saw something most others missed. Not anger, not shame. Resolve. It was subtle, almost invisible, like the faint tightening of a thread or the closing of a book whose story was not meant to be shared aloud. It was as though, in that single moment of exclusion, he had made a decision, one he would not announce, but one that would shape everything that came after. And though no one else at that glittering table knew it, they had just lost something they could never get back. Later that evening, after the dancing had begun and laughter spilled across the hall, my father slipped away. The music, bright brass and violins, echoed through the walls, but in the narrow corridor near the coachroom it grew faint, muffled as if the party existed in another world. The air was cooler here, tinged with starch from pressed linen stacked on carts, the faint chemical scent of polished wood. He had come for a moment of quiet, to breathe, to steady himself after the sting of being turned away from his rightful place. But the quiet he found was broken by voices. 2 doors down, near the staff entrance, stood my stepmother and her brother. Their words carried through the half-open doorway, unguarded in their certainty that no one else was listening. "He's practically useless now," she said, her tone sharp, each syllable cutting like glass. "What does he bring except embarrassment? Did you see those shoes?" Her brother chuckled, low and dismissive. "The man's finished. You've already got the house in your name, don't you? All that's left is to convince him to sell the old place. Imagine the money we could free up." The sound of ice clinking in a glass punctuated the sentence. My father stood frozen, back against the wall. The corridor light flickered overhead, casting shadows that shifted across his face. He did not move closer, nor did he retreat. He simply listened. Each word seemed to strike him in a place deeper than bone, into memory, into trust. "He doesn't need that property anymore," his wife continued, her voice laced with impatience. "It's wasted on him. He'll just let it rot. Better that we push him, make him see reason. If he resists, well, we'll remind him he owes us. After all, hasn't he been living off us for years? Living off us." The phrase lodged itself in his chest like a shard. This after decades of providing, of giving without keeping. After the quiet accounts, the careful savings, the sacrifices no one had seen. To her, he was not a man who had built. He was a burden to be carried, a stain to be hidden away. His breath grew shallow. He pressed his palm against the cool wall, steadying himself. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning the music from the ballroom, and then came the final blow. Her brother asked with a scoff, "What about his children? Won't they object?" She laughed, a short, bitter laugh that did not belong in a marriage vow. "They're too busy enjoying themselves to care. Besides, when he's gone, they'll thank me for managing things. They'll see I was right." The laugh echoed down the corridor, light but merciless. My father closed his eyes. The sound carried him back through the years, to nights of exhaustion, to mornings when he rose before the sun to provide, to the swing set he built, the heater he fixed, the countless moments when love had taken the shape of action. And here he stood, invisible, reduced to an inconvenience. His chest tightened. For a moment he feared the strength of his own heart might betray him, might stop altogether, but it held as it always had. Barely. He turned then, slowly, careful not to let his shoes squeak against the polished floor. His silence was not surrender, it was preservation. He walked back down the corridor, each step heavy, his body aware of the weight his spirit carried. The laughter from the hall swelled as he approached, clashing with the sharp memory of the words he could not unhear. At the doorway he paused, gripping the frame. The scent of roses from the centerpieces drifted toward him, masking nothing. The violins played on, cheerful, unknowing. He re-entered the hall with his face composed, his back straight. No one noticed the difference. No one knew that something had broken quietly inside him in a place too deep for eyes to see. But I would come to learn that it was in that very moment, the moment when their whispers turned into daggers, that my father began to plan. Because a broken heart can weep, or it can harden, and his chose the latter. The night after the wedding, he didn't sleep. He lay still for a while, eyes open in the dark, the room shaped in gray by a street lamp outside. The blinds made thin ladders of light across the ceiling. Somewhere a dog barked, then stopped, as if embarrassed by its own noise. He waited for exhaustion to claim him, but the words he had heard in the corridor would not quiet. They scratched at the inside of his chest. Near 3 in the morning he rose. The kitchen was cool, the tile cold beneath his feet. He put water on the stove and listened for the small, familiar click before the burner caught. When the kettle began to murmur, he opened the drawer where he kept his most ordinary things: rubber bands, a letter opener, a handful of old nails saved for no good reason. Beneath them lay a small, unopened notebook he'd bought months earlier on a whim at the pharmacy checkout. Brown cover, rough to the touch, unremarkable. That was the point. He set it on the table as if placing down a living thing. Steam braided up from his mug. The tea was plain and a little bitter. He didn't mind. He pulled a pen from the jar beside the sugar, one of those cheap ones you get free from an insurance office, and tested it on the margin of an envelope. The ink came slow at first, then steady. First page. He printed the date in careful block letters. Then in a smaller hand a title. What was said? He wrote the words exactly as he remembered them. No decoration. No anger added to them. The hallway, the smell of furniture polish, the light that flickered, his wife's voice, her brother's laugh. How the word useless did not echo so much as land heavy. He noted the time as best he could, the song the band had been playing just before, the distance from the ballroom door to the staff entrance. He turned the pen on its side and underlined twice. He paused and flexed his fingers. The joints in his right hand ached, a dull, constant complaint born from years of turning wrenches, lifting lumber, signing checks no one knew about. He pressed his thumb into the web of his palm until the ache eased, then continued. On the second page he wrote a list, short lines each with a small square beside it. House deed original copy, bank accounts where balance beneficiaries, old place appraisal taxes paid, insurance policies current, contact Harris and Bell card and wallet, conversation logs, dates, locations, exact phrasing. Beside Harris and Bell he drew a tiny star. He didn't intend to call the number tonight. Not yet, but the star meant soon. He flipped forward and on the top of each page carefully penciled a week of future dates. He added tabs, just cut bits of masking tape with a kitchen scissor, labeling sections, calls, receipts, promises, threats. The last one he wrote small, as if the word itself should be kept quiet. He wrote until the kettle cooled. When he finally closed the notebook, the kitchen clock said 4:12. The refrigerator hummed its soft, tireless note. He rinsed the mug, turned the light off, and carried the notebook to the bedroom like a candle he didn't want to let go out. He slid it beneath the bottom drawer of his dresser, a place even dust forgot. Morning came pale and thin. He woke with the metallic taste of too little sleep. His wife, hair perfect even at sunrise, asked if he'd be home for dinner. He said yes. She kissed the air near his cheek and left a lipstick ghost on the space between them. When the door closed, the house exhaled. He went to the pharmacy to buy more notebooks. The clerk didn't look up. The radio behind the register played a song from 20 years ago, a melody he remembered whistling while tightening bolts in a hot garage. He paid cash, no bag. He liked the weight of the stack in his hands. On the walk home, the sky was winter blue, hard and clean. A delivery truck rattled by and left a cough of diesel in the air. He coughed too, at first from the fumes and then from the quiet laugh that surprised him, a single breath. Imagine that, he thought, a man my age buying school supplies to save his life. Back at the kitchen table, he set up his tools like a craftsman. Notebooks, pen, a yellow highlighter, a roll of tape, an old flip phone with a scratched screen. He plugged the phone in. It warmed in his palm, a small sun. Midday, the first test came. His wife called from the car. Her voice was bright with cheer that did not reach its target. "I talked to a realtor," she said casually, like someone mentioning milk. "She says the market's strong. It would be smart to list the old place before spring." He listened. He said he needed to think. He asked for the realtor's name. He wrote it down. He circled it twice and marked the time of the call. When she hung up, he set the phone on the table and felt his heart knock once hard against his ribs. Not pain, warning. He breathed until the rhythm calmed. In the afternoon, he drove to the old place. Clouds moved low, the kind that make the day seem nearer to the ground. The porch steps creaked in the exact places they had creaked since we were children. He put his hand on the railing and felt the splinters seeking purchase in his skin. He didn't pull away. He pressed his palm flat, accepting the prick, then let go. Inside, the air held the faintest trace of cedar and dust. He opened the windows. Cold air rolled in and raised gooseflesh along his forearms. He took out the notebook and stood in the kitchen where he had once taught us the math of measuring flour for pancakes. He wrote down the current condition of every room. He took photographs with the old phone, corners, baseboards, the water heater's serial number, the date stamped by the camera like a notary seal. He found the metal box in the hallway closet, the one with the spare keys, extra batteries, the kind of items families collect and forget. Beneath it lay a manila envelope with property taxes, paid on time every year. He took a slow picture of each page, then returned them to the envelope with the care of a librarian. In the late light, he walked the yard. The maple at the back fence had grafted its roots around a stone, stubborn and beautiful. He put his palm on the bark and felt its faint dampness. He wrote, "Maple, sound, leave in Wilta house, do not cut." The sentence made no sense to anyone but him, but it anchored him to something living that could not be bought or sold. At dusk, he closed the windows and drove home. The sky was a bruise of purples fading into blue. Streetlights blinked awake one by one, a polite chorus. He parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest. He wanted the air. He wanted to arrive with his thoughts aligned. At dinner, his wife spoke of centerpieces and seating charts for a brunch she was planning. She did not ask about his day. He did not offer it. The silverware clicked against plates like a metronome. When she excused herself to take a call, he lifted the notebook from beneath his chair and slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket. He had reinforced that pocket with 2 neat stitches that afternoon. The fabric scratched lightly against his knuckles. It felt like armor. Before bed, he stood at the bathroom mirror, the light too bright, unforgiving. He looked at his own face as if it belonged to someone else, a man who had been underestimated so thoroughly that it had become a form of freedom. He smoothed his hair with water from the tap. It ran cold over his fingers and woke him with a clean sting. He returned the notebook to its place beneath the bottom drawer. Then he lay down beside the woman who would not pass his test and closed his eyes. When sleep finally came, it came not as surrender, but as strategy, like a soldier taking rest before dawn. In the morning, the list would continue, the squares would fill, the dates would stack, and the man everyone believed to be small would keep writing, line after line, in a book large enough to hold the truth. I only learned about that meeting years later, when Mr. Bell himself showed me the notes from their conversation and copies of the entries from my father's notebook. What I tell here comes from those pages. The first time he visited Harris and Bell, the law office was nearly empty. It was late morning, the kind of hour when the world outside still carried the smell of fresh bread from bakeries and the sharp bite of brewed coffee drifting out of open cafe doors. Inside the office, the air was cooler, tinged faintly with paper and polished oak. The blinds were half-drawn, slicing the sunlight into pale bars across the carpet. He had called ahead, though barely. A simple message on their voicemail. "This is Robert. I'd like to talk, something important." He had not even left a last name. Still, when he walked in, the receptionist looked up and smiled as if she had been expecting him. "Mr. Bell will see you," she said. The man waiting behind the desk was younger than him by 2 decades, but there was a steadiness in his eyes, the kind of weight carried only by someone who had listened to too many confessions and witnessed too many families tear themselves apart over what was left behind. "Robert," the lawyer said, standing to shake his hand. His grip was firm, not showy, the kind of handshake that told you he was listening before you even spoke. They sat across from one another. Leather chair sighed under his weight. He set his notebook on the desk. Its brown cover looked plain against the polished surface, but to him it might as well have been ironclad. Bell tapped the notebook lightly. "This yours?" He nodded. Every word in there was said. "I don't want it twisted. I don't want it forgotten." For a moment he didn't speak. He let the silence sit between them. Then, as if releasing something heavy he had been carrying too long, he began. He spoke of the wedding, the whispers, the corridor, his wife's laugh, her brother's plan, the word useless delivered like a knife. Bell didn't interrupt. He only scribbled in a pad, occasionally lifting his eyes to watch the way Robert's hands clenched when he recited the sentences. When he finished, Robert pushed the notebook across the desk. "It's all there, dates, times, what was said. I want you to make sure it means something if I'm not around to say it myself." Bell flipped through, the pages whispering against one another. "You've been careful," he said finally. "Very careful. Most people come in here with nothing but stories. You came with evidence." Robert leaned back, the chair creaking. He folded his arms and looked at the blinds, at the way light split across the room. "Stories don't protect anyone, paper does." The lawyer studied him. "You want protection for your children." "Yes," Robert said without hesitation. "Everything goes to them, not to her, not to anyone she brings into this house. I want it airtight." Bell closed the notebook gently, as if it were fragile. "That can be arranged, but you need to know when the time comes it won't be clean. People fight, especially the ones who feel entitled." Robert smiled, faint but sharp. "Let her fight, let her show herself. I want the world to see who she really is." There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. They went over the details, titles, beneficiaries, the old house, the business account, insurance policies. Bell explained the process with the calm precision of someone threading a needle. What papers to file, where signatures must go, how to ensure nothing could be undone in secret. At one point, Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside were photocopies, deeds, statements, receipts, each marked with neat notes in his handwriting. He laid them out carefully, one by one, until the desk looked less like an office and more like a chessboard mid-game. Bell glanced at him, impressed. "You've been preparing for this longer than today." Robert sipped the water set in front of him, the glass cool in his palm. A man prepares the moment he realizes he's no longer loved for who he is, only for what he has. The rest is just waiting. When the meeting ended, Bell stood and shook his hand again. "We'll keep in touch," he said. "I'll draft the documents. You'll have the first copies in a week." Robert tucked the notebook back under his arm. He walked out of the office into the sharp brightness of midday, the air warmer now, alive with car horns and footsteps and the hum of the city. But he felt none of the noise inside him, only a steadiness. For the first time in months he did not feel invisible. He felt armored, not by wealth, not by power, but by foresight. That evening when he returned home, the house smelled faintly of garlic and simmering tomatoes. His wife was on the phone, pacing the kitchen, laughing at something he couldn't hear. He hung his coat on the rack, his hand brushing against the hidden pocket where the notebook rested. Her laugh rose again, careless, cutting through the air. He moved past her, quiet as always, but this time with the certain knowledge that every careless word, every hidden scheme would meet its reckoning. The lawyer had seen him. The papers would speak. And the man she thought finished had only just begun. It began with small things. Not the grand gestures of a man trying to prove a point. The quiet experiments of someone who wanted to see, really see, what lay in the hearts of those around him. The first came on a gray Tuesday morning. He set his coffee down on the counter and told his wife in a voice almost casual, "I'm feeling lightheaded. Maybe I should lie down." She looked up briefly from her tablet, eyes flicking past him as though he were a shadow moving across the wall. "You'll be fine," she said, tapping at the screen. "Take some aspirin." He lingered a moment, waiting for concern that never came. She never asked if he wanted water, never placed a hand on his arm. The silence of her indifference filled the room more than any words could. He wrote it down later in the notebook, test 1. No care. The next came that Friday evening. He mentioned that the car needed work, that he wasn't sure he could cover the cost just yet. His wife's brother, sitting across the table with a glass of whiskey, barked a laugh. "Sell the old place already," he said. "You'll have cash for everything you need." Robert nodded as if the suggestion were reasonable, though he could feel his pulse quicken. He waited for his wife to contradict him, to soften the edge of her brother's greed. She didn't. Instead, she sipped her wine and looked away. He wrote that down too, test 2, pressure applied, complicity confirmed. But it wasn't only the failures he sought. He tested the children as well. On Sunday, his eldest son. "I've been short on groceries," he said lightly, "and the fridge is looking bare. Could you drop by?" An hour later his son arrived with 2 bags, apples, bread, a carton of milk, not extravagant but enough. He helped stock the shelves, asked nothing in return, and stayed long enough to brew coffee and sit across from him. They talked about nothing and everything: the weather, his son's work, a ball game they both knew neither had watched. When his son left, Robert felt a warmth that no meal could match. In the notebook he wrote, test 3, loyalty intact. The middle daughter was tested differently. He phoned her one night and said, "I think I may need help with a bill, just a small one. I don't want to bother anyone." Her voice came through the line, firm and sure. "You're not a bother. I'll cover it, Dad. Don't think twice." He could hear a baby crying in the background, the exhaustion in her tone, the stretch of her thin patience. Still, she offered without hesitation. When he hung up, he sat in the quiet kitchen, his eyes burning though no tears fell. Test 4, heart steady. But not every child passed. His youngest hesitated. When Robert mentioned, almost apologetically, that he might need a hand paying for a small repair on the house, the reply came wrapped in excuses. "It's a bad time, things are tight, maybe ask someone else." The words stung, not because of the money, which he didn't need, but because of the reluctance, the distance, the subtle suggestion that responsibility was a burden too heavy to share. In the notebook the line read, test 5. Hesitation noted. Days passed, each bringing a new test. He feigned a cough, let the phone ring longer than usual before answering, deliberately misplaced a bill to see who would notice. Patterns emerged. Some people grew sharper, colder, circling like crows sensing weakness. Others leaned in, unshaken, their presence quiet but solid. He catalogued it all: the time of day, the words used, the pauses between sentences. The notebook swelled with entries, a chronicle of character written in ordinary ink. And yet, for all the recording, the act of watching cut him deeply. He had always believed loyalty revealed itself in moments of need. But to summon those moments deliberately, to stage his own vulnerability, it felt like pressing on a bruise just to see who winced. At night, he lay awake, hearing the echo of voices: his wife's dismissal, his daughter's firm promise, his son's steady companionship, the hesitation of the youngest. The house carried its own sounds: the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the occasional groan of settling beams. He let each sound mark the passage of another test survived, another truth revealed. One evening, when the sun had burned itself down to a thin line of orange on the horizon, he stood at the window with the notebook in hand. The glass was cool against his forehead. Outside, children's voices floated from the street, high and carefree. A dog barked, a screen door slammed. Life moved without knowing the weight he carried. He turned to a blank page and wrote a sentence, not in his usual measured hand, but in letters large enough to shake. "When the time comes, only the true will remain." He closed the book slowly, the cover rough beneath his fingers, and slid it back into its place. His chest felt heavy but not hollow, heavy like a man who has gathered all the evidence he needs, waiting for the moment to bring it into the light. And in that heaviness there was resolve. It was early September, the air just beginning to cool, when the family gathered for the birthday party. The invitation came in a glossy envelope, cream-colored with gold lettering pressed into the paper. It smelled faintly of perfume when he opened it, as if even the card itself had been dressed for the occasion. It was his wife's birthday dinner, a celebration arranged not at home, but at a private dining hall, the kind with velvet curtains drawn thick across tall windows, where candles glowed in glass cylinders and every fork had a twin waiting in perfect symmetry. He read the card twice, then slipped it into his notebook, not between the first pages where evidence lived, but deeper where intentions hid. The night arrived crisp and clear, the street slick with recent rain. He walked slowly toward the building, his breath a faint cloud in the air. The scent of wet asphalt clung to him as he entered, replaced quickly by the aroma of roasted meats, wine, and a hint of lemon polish on the wooden floor. Guests filled the room, laughter ringing too brightly, glasses lifted in rehearsed joy. His wife shone at the center, wrapped in emerald silk, her lips the same shade of red that had stopped him at the wedding table. She was radiant, practiced, and already tipsy with admiration. When he stepped inside, the air shifted just slightly, an imperceptible dip in warmth, as if his presence drew away the room's patience. He was shown to a seat at the far end, a place set neatly but clearly apart. The head of the table remained full, his wife, her brother, their friends, people who now spoke of mortgages and travel plans as if they alone held the world's balance in their pockets. He sat, folded his napkin, and listened. The first toast was light-hearted. The second grew bolder, laced with jokes that strayed toward cruelty. One man raised his glass and said, "To the lady of the night, may her house always be filled with joy and maybe fewer creaking floorboards from older company." Laughter erupted. Not all at once, but in ripples, some nervous, some sharp. His wife smiled without glancing at him. He sipped water, cool against his lips, his throat dry though he forced it to swallow. His hand remained steady though his chest tightened. Through the chatter, he picked out words meant not for him, but not hidden either. The time he signed it over. He'll come around once he realizes. Old houses don't last, but the cash does. The language of vultures dressed in silk and pressed collars. He wrote none of it down that night. Instead, he carried each phrase in his body, letting it settle heavy in his shoulders, in the ache of his back, in the way his jaw stayed clenched long after the room's laughter faded. Midway through the meal, his wife rose. She clinked her spoon gently against her glass, the sound delicate but commanding. "Thank you all for being here," she said, voice smooth, her smile wide enough to hide anything behind it. "This year has been extraordinary, and it feels only right to celebrate surrounded by those who truly matter." She glanced down the table then, her eyes flicking past him, not landing, not lingering. The omission was deliberate, as sharp as any spoken word. The room applauded. He raised his glass too, slow, deliberate, but his lips did not part for a smile. Later, as dessert arrived, small towers of chocolate balanced on fragile plates, her brother leaned across the table. "So, Robert," he said, voice carrying further than courtesy required, "any news about that old place? Everyone's been wondering what you'll do. Seems a shame to let it sit empty. Property values don't wait forever." The room quieted just enough to make space for the question. Forks paused, wineglasses hovered midair. Robert set down his spoon. His reflection stared back at him from the silver, warped and thin. He lifted his eyes, met his brother-in-law's smirk, and said evenly, "I haven't decided yet." The words were calm, but his chest burned with their weight. Around him, the air seemed to thicken. He could hear the faint buzz of the light overhead, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Every sound amplified, as if the world itself leaned in to hear what he might say next. But he said nothing more. He let silence do its work. The brother scoffed, filling the void with false bravado. "Well, don't take too long. Opportunity doesn't wait on old men." More laughter. A few tried to soften it with smiles aimed his way, sympathetic but hollow. He nodded once as if he hadn't heard and picked up his spoon again. The chocolate on the plate had begun to collapse, its structure giving way to gravity. He ate slowly, each bite measured, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, he felt the ledger in his mind grow sharper, each remark etched deeper. The tests were no longer private trials he devised, they had become public theater, and every actor at that table had shown their hand. When the dinner ended, candles burned low, wax pooling at their bases. Guests pressed coats over their arms, perfumes mingling into a single heavy scent. His wife basked in compliments, her laughter high and bright as glass breaking. Robert stood apart, notebook heavy in his jacket pocket though untouched. He didn't need to write tonight. Every insult, every omission, every hungry glance at what wasn't theirs, he carried them etched in memory, carved as deep as stone. And as he stepped into the cool night air, the streets still wet from the afternoon rain, he knew the time for silence was nearly over. By late November, when the leaves had thinned to bare branches, another dinner was arranged. The gathering was supposed to be ordinary, another dinner, another evening where wine flowed and conversation circled the same tired themes. But this time he came prepared not with silence, not with observation, but with a decision. The hall was bright with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light in fragments across the walls. Silverware gleamed, the tablecloths crisp and white. The clink of glasses created a rhythm beneath the chatter, a kind of music that tried too hard to sound like harmony. Robert sat near the end again, as he often did, but in his jacket pocket was the notebook, and beneath his arm was a leather folder, worn but firm, filled with papers that carried more weight than any laugh or insult that had ever been thrown his way. It began, as it often did, with a comment. His wife's brother leaned back in his chair, his voice raised just enough to carry. "Robert, you've had plenty of time to decide. Everyone knows that old house is a waste. What are you holding onto, memories? It's time you let it go." Laughter bubbled up from the table, not from joy but from habit. Even his wife's smile tightened as she looked his way, expecting him to shrink into the shadows as always. But Robert did not shrink. He placed his fork gently on the plate, the porcelain giving a soft chime. He rose. The room quieted. I remember that moment vividly because I was sitting at the table, watching as my father placed the leather folder down in front of everyone. "I've listened long enough," he said, his voice steady, not raised, but carrying a weight that silenced even the glasses mid-toast. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folder. Its leather smelled faintly of age, of ink, of nights spent alone at a kitchen table. He laid it on the center of the table, over the untouched desserts and scattered crumbs. "These are the deeds," he said. He opened the folder with deliberate care, his fingers slow, giving time for every eye in the room to focus. "The house, the accounts, the investments you assumed were gone." Gasps rippled through the room, chairs shifted, someone muttered under their breath. He unfolded the first document, the crackle of paper loud in the silence. The deed to the house, his name clear, taxes paid in full. Then the account statements, numbers lined in black ink, steady, undeniable. Lifted his gaze, letting his eyes move from face to face. "This is my fortune." His wife's lips parted, painted smile faltering. She reached as if to touch the papers, but he pulled them back, the gesture small but final. "You spoke of me as a burden," he continued, his voice low but sharper now. "You laughed at shoes, at silence, at the man you thought had nothing. But everything you dismissed, everything you plotted to take was here, waiting." He let the words settle, their edges cutting through the heavy air. The brother-in-law's face flushed red. "You can't just—" "I can," Robert interrupted, his tone unshaken, "and I have." He turned a page, revealing prepared transfers ready to be finalized, the signatures still fresh, ink dark against the pale paper. "It's prepared, soon to be locked, out of your reach. Every dollar, every acre, every bond belongs where it was always meant to, my children, my grandchildren, not to greed, not to convenience." The silence now was different than before. Not awkward, not dismissive. It was thick, weighted with the collapse of pretense. His wife's eyes darted around the table, searching for support, but found only the blank stares of those too shocked to speak. Robert straightened, his shoulders square, his breath steady. "For years I gave without asking," he said. "I worked. I sacrificed. I built something from nothing, and I asked for nothing in return but respect. When that respect was gone, I chose silence. But tonight you will see me, and you will see the truth." He tapped the papers once, the sound sharp against the wood. "This is my fortune, and it will never be yours." A chair scraped suddenly. One of his sons rose, his face pale but resolute. He moved to his father's side, resting a hand on the back of his chair. Another followed, then his daughter. Slowly, as if realizing the shift in the room's gravity, the children stood together, forming a quiet line beside him. The sight filled the room with a presence stronger than any laughter had ever carried. Robert closed the folder, the snap of leather final, and tucked it under his arm again. He looked once more at his wife, her painted face now cracked with disbelief, and then at the brother still fuming in silence. "I am not leaving empty-handed," he said. "I am leaving with everything that matters." Then, without another word, he stepped back from the table, his children moving with him, the air around them charged with something unspoken but undeniable. And the fortune he revealed that night was not only measured in paper and ink. It was measured in the undeniable truth that he had seen through them all and chosen his side. The silence after his declaration lingered like smoke. The folder under his arm, the signatures and deeds now seared into every guest's memory, hung in the room with more weight than any chandelier above their heads. His wife shifted first. She laughed too quickly, too loud, a brittle sound that cracked against the walls of the dining hall. "Robert," she said, her voice pitched in a tone meant to soften, but it rang with strain. "You're making a spectacle. These papers, this is all unnecessary." No one joined her laugh, not one person smiled. Her brother leaned forward, face red and jaw tight. "He's bluffing," he said, though his eyes betrayed him. They darted toward the papers as if fearing their truth. Robert stood unmoving, his shoulders calm, his children still gathered close like pillars bracing him. Then he spoke, each word clipped, deliberate. "Would you like to hear it?" He pulled the notebook from his jacket. Its brown cover seemed almost ordinary under the candlelight, but when he opened it, the pages carried the gravity of months. He began to read, slowly, clearly, his voice steady enough that every corner of the room could hear. "He's practically useless now." His eyes stayed on the page, though the words filled the air like shards of glass. "All that's left is to convince him to sell. He owes us. Hasn't he been living off us for years?" A collective gasp rose. Forks clattered against plates. One woman pressed her hand to her mouth as if to keep the words from sinking further. His wife's face drained of color, the red of her lipstick now too bright against her pallor. "That's not," she stammered. "That was taken out of," but he turned another page, the paper rustling like the turning of judgment. "When he's gone, they'll thank me for managing things. They'll see I was right." The echo of her own words filled the hall, undeniable. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down at their plates, their appetite gone. Others stared openly, eyes flicking between Robert and the woman beside him, as though witnessing a play too raw for theater. His wife's fingers curled tightly around her wine glass. The stem snapped with a sharp crack, spilling red across the white linen like blood. She flinched, shards scattering near her plate, but no one moved to help. Her brother muttered under his breath, but the room had turned against them both. The weight of evidence was too heavy, the betrayal too plain. Robert closed the notebook gently. The sound was soft but final. He looked at her then, not with anger, not even with triumph, but with a sorrow so steady it felt like condemnation. "You thought I wouldn't hear," he said. "You thought I wouldn't remember, but I listened, and I remembered everything." The candles flickered, their flames bowing as if in agreement. His wife's hand trembled. She tried to speak, to gather the room back to her side, but her voice faltered. The polish she wore like armor had cracked. Every word came out thinner, sharper, desperate. "You don't understand." But the room did understand. They had heard, they had seen. A cousin whispered, "She used him." Another murmured, "After all he did." The whispers, once against Robert, now shifted toward her. They spread like fire through dry grass, unstoppable, consuming. Her emerald silk dress shimmered under the lights, but no one admired it now. The jewels at her ears looked heavy, absurd. All the adornments she had worn to mark herself above others now seemed only to weigh her down. She sat rigid, her face caught between fury and shame, her lips pressed so tightly together the color smeared at the edges. Robert's children remained standing beside him, their presence unspoken judgment. One reached for the folder, holding it carefully as though carrying a torch. Robert turned slightly, addressing not her but the room. "Respect is not bought with dresses or dinners. It is not measured by what you take. It is proven by what you give." A murmur of agreement rose, soft but certain. Heads nodded. Eyes turned away from her, back to him. For the first time that evening his wife looked small, not because of her size, but because the stage she had built for herself had been stripped bare. Her laughter no longer mattered. Her beauty no longer shielded her. She was exposed, her words revealed, her intentions laid out in black and white ink. The feast continued around her, plates removed, candles burned lower, but she no longer belonged to the celebration. She was an intruder at her own table, sitting amid the ruins of her own ambition, and every eye that avoided hers was another stone placed on the wall of her humiliation. Robert did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, notebook closed, folder safe under his arm, and walked out of the hall with his children at his side. Behind him, his wife sat frozen, the broken glass glinting like fragments of a crown at her place setting. And in that stillness, in the silence she could not escape, her humiliation was complete. After that night, the first weeks of January were cold and gray when Robert returned to Belle's office. What had been prepared before was now finalized, sealed with the lawyer's stamp, and filed beyond reversal. I only came to know about that visit much later, when my father recounted the events to us. But what happened that day sealed everything. The night after the dinner, the house was unbearably still. The lamps cast soft pools of yellow light, but the silence pressed heavier than the shadows. Robert sat at the kitchen table, the folder before him, the notebook open to its final section. His pen hovered above the page, then dropped steadily, deliberate strokes filling the lines. This was no longer just record-keeping. It was execution. Every deed, every account, every insurance policy had been prepared, drafted with Bell's careful precision. What remained was choice. And choice, he realized, was the sharpest weapon he had. He thought of the humiliation his wife had endured in the dining hall, the broken glass, the gasps, the whispers that had turned against her. It had been satisfying, yes, but incomplete. Exposure without consequence was just theater. He wanted permanence. He wanted finality. So he began to write a declaration, not in legalese but in the language of truth. To my children and their children, what I have built belongs to you, not because of blood alone, but because of the love you gave when I had nothing. Every sacrifice was for this, for you, and no one who mocked or measured me will inherit a single coin. He signed it with a hand that did not tremble. The pen left a heavy line, black and certain. The following week he returned to Bell's office. This time he brought all of it: deeds, account transfers, the notarized will. Bell read through each page with the focus of a surgeon. "You're certain?" the lawyer asked quietly. "I've never been more certain," Robert replied. His voice was low, calm, carrying the weight of a man who had lived long enough to understand that silence sometimes protects but action liberates. Bell nodded, slid the documents into a file, and stamped each with a seal that left the faint scent of warm ink in the room. The sound of the press locking down echoed like a gavel. When Robert walked out, the city seemed sharper, brighter. The cold air cut his lungs clean, and for the first time in years, he felt not hidden but whole. The reversal revealed itself days later, a family gathering his wife had arranged in a desperate attempt to reclaim her image. She dressed carefully, in sapphire blue this time, her hair pinned high, her jewelry loud. The dining room was filled with familiar faces, though the laughter sounded thinner, the conversations clipped. Robert arrived last, his children trailing behind him. He carried nothing but a single envelope, tucked inside his jacket. The meal moved with forced cheer. His wife told stories that bent toward her own importance, each one punctuated with a laugh that reached no further than her lips. Then, when dessert plates were cleared, Robert rose. "I have one final thing to share," he said. His voice was calm, but the room leaned into his words. Even his wife froze, fork midway to her mouth. He pulled the envelope from his jacket, opened it, and laid the papers on the table. Not copies this time, but the final sealed documents. "This is my will," he said. "It has been signed, notarized, and filed. It cannot be changed, not by whispers, not by pressure, not by anyone but me, and I will not change it." He paused, let the air thicken around him. The candles flickered, casting shadows across faces now pale with anticipation. "My children will inherit everything, every account, every property, every bond, to them and only them." His wife surged forward, her chair screeching against the floor. "You can't, I already have." The words landed like stone, the room stirred. The children exchanged glances, some wide-eyed, some with tears glimmering but unshed. His eldest son placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him, confirming him. Robert straightened. "You thought the test was yours to give," he said, looking at his wife, his voice no louder but sharp as glass. "But it was mine, and you failed." A murmur spread through the room, like wind before a storm. His wife's face burned crimson, her brother shifting uncomfortably at her side, his hands restless, his smirk gone. Robert gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and tapped it once on the table. The sound echoed in the hush. "This is the reversal," he said. "For years you treated me as a man without power. Tonight you see the truth. I was never powerless. I was patient." His wife collapsed back into her chair, her eyes glassy, her lips trembling but wordless. The jewels at her neck seemed suddenly gaudy, cheapened by the emptiness of her protest. And Robert, standing tall in the quiet aftermath, felt something lift inside him, not triumph, not vengeance, but release. The fortune was no longer a secret, the power no longer hidden. The man they dismissed had become the man they could not ignore. And in that moment, the reversal was complete. By early spring, when the maples had begun to bud, Robert handed his children the keys to their new home. The morning he handed them the keys, the sky was washed in pale gold. Light spilled across the driveway, catching in the windows of the house that stood waiting, its siding freshly painted, its roof dark and strong against the soft horizon. Robert stood a little apart from his children, the cool metal of the keys warm in his palm. He could feel their weight, not in ounces, but in years, the weight of promises kept, of sacrifices finally given form. His eldest son stepped closer first. "Dad," he said, his voice rough, low, as though he was trying to swallow the moment whole, "is this really for us?" Robert pressed the keys into his hand. The sound was small, a faint clink, but it carried like a bell through the crisp air. "Yes," he said simply, "for you, for your families, for what comes next." The children moved through the house slowly, reverently, their footsteps echoing on bare hardwood floors. The scent of new paint mingled with the faint trace of sawdust, still lingering from the workmen who had finished only days earlier. In the kitchen, his daughter ran her fingers across the countertop, polished stone cool beneath her hand. She laughed softly, not out of amusement, but relief, the kind of laugh that comes when a weight you didn't know you carried finally slips away. Her youngest leaned into the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame, eyes wide as they scanned the space. We could build everything here," they whispered, half to themselves. Robert stood back, watching. He let them explore, let them open every door, peer into every room, fling open the windows to let the breeze carry through. He remembered when those same children had run barefoot across cracked linoleum floors, chasing each other through a house too small for their laughter. He remembered the nights of patching roofs with tar, of stretching meals thin so no one would notice the hunger was his alone. Now those memories lived only in him. What he had built for them was different, sturdy, spacious, free from the leaks and the ceilings that groaned under weight. They gathered in the living room, where sunlight pooled in wide rectangles across the floor. His son crouched, running his hand over the grain of the wood. His daughter leaned against the window frame, eyes glassy, blinking hard. "Dad," she said quietly, "we don't deserve this." He shook his head. His voice came low, steady. "You deserve more than I could ever give. This is only what I can do now." The words sat in the room, soft but unmovable. Later they walked through the yard. The grass was still damp from last night's rain, cool beneath their shoes. At the far end stood a maple, young but firm, its leaves trembling faintly in the breeze. Robert placed his hand against its trunk, the bark rough under his palm. "This tree," he said, "will grow taller than the house. You'll see it every morning, every season. Remember, it was planted to stand longer than me." The children stood beside him, following his gaze upward into branches already reaching. The air smelled of earth and rain. A bird cut across the sky, its wings flashing white in the sun. For a long time they were silent, each lost in their own thread of memory, each tying it now to this place. Inside again, Robert unfolded a packet of papers on the counter. Not deeds or contracts this time, those had already been signed, sealed, delivered. These were letters, one for each child. Handwritten, his script careful, deliberate, filling the page in lines that dipped only slightly where his hand had trembled. "I've left words for you," he said. "Read them when you're ready, not before." They looked at the envelopes, their names written across the front. None of them reached out yet. They understood the weight of a sealed letter, the gravity of something meant to last. As evening fell, they lit the fireplace for the first time. The scent of smoke curled upward, new and raw, mingling with the warmth of burning wood. The children sat close, their voices low, speaking of what might come, holidays, grandchildren, mornings with coffee on the porch. Robert sat apart, in a chair just slightly back from the firelight. His face glowed in the flicker, lined with shadows that made him look both older and stronger. He watched them, listened to the way their words wove together, and felt the quiet peace of a man who had nothing left to prove. The house was theirs now. The future theirs too. And in the crackle of the fire, in the scent of wood and warmth filling the room, he heard not just relief, but the beginning of something that would endure long after he was gone. Almost a year had passed. Late autumn returned, and with it, Robert's quiet decision to leave for the cottage at the edge of town. The house was quiet when Robert closed the door behind him for the last time. It wasn't the children's new home, no, that space was alive now with voices and laughter, with the scratch of chairs across fresh wood floors and the smell of meals already being cooked in its kitchen. This was the house he had shared with his wife, the one where whispers had grown sharper than knives. Tonight, it was empty. He walked through each room slowly, not with sorrow but with a kind of still reverence. The ticking of the clock in the hallway echoed louder than usual. The curtains, drawn back, allowed the moonlight to spill across the carpet in pale ribbons. He paused in the kitchen, resting a hand on the cool edge of the counter. Once this space had been filled with mornings, coffee, cereal bowls, the shuffle of slippers on tile. Tonight only the hum of the refrigerator remained. He turned off the lights, one by one, until the whole house lay dim behind him. His suitcase was not heavy. A few shirts, a jacket, a well-used pair of boots. No folder, no legal papers, no evidence of the battle he had fought and won. Those things were finished now, sealed and safe. In his pocket he carried only the notebook, not to write in anymore but to keep close, like a map he no longer needed but couldn't discard. The night air greeted him cool and damp, scented with pine and a faint trace of wood smoke drifting from nearby chimneys. He walked down the path without haste, his steps crunching softly against gravel. Each sound echoed finality, measured, calm, deliberate. He did not go far. A modest cottage waited at the edge of town, small enough to feel like shelter, not burden. Its roof was plain, its paint fading, but the porch faced east where the sun would rise. That was enough. When he arrived, he set his suitcase on the floorboards and exhaled a long, slow breath. The air inside was faint with dust, but it was honest. A single chair sat by the window. He lowered himself into it, feeling the wood creak beneath his weight, and listened to the silence. It was not the silence of dismissal or judgment, not the silence of being overlooked at a table. It was gentler, the silence of space that belonged only to him. Days slipped into rhythm. In the mornings he woke with the light, the first glow of dawn spilling across the floorboards, in soft strokes of pink and gold. He brewed coffee on a small stove, its aroma filling the little room, and carried the mug outside. The porch was cool beneath his feet, the boards rough but familiar. Birds stirred in the trees, their wings catching the early light. He would sit there, hands wrapped around the mug, watching the sky brighten. He did not think of what had been taken from him. He thought instead of what had been given, keys in his children's hands, the maple tree standing tall in their yard, the laughter carried in letters they now sent, telling him of dinners and plans for the future. Sometimes he walked into town. The streets were quiet in the mornings, shop windows glowing with fresh displays. At the bakery, the scent of warm bread wrapped around him, and the girl behind the counter always asked how he was settling in. He nodded, offered a small smile, bought a single roll, and walked back with the paper bag crinkling in his hand. At night, he cooked simply, stews, eggs, whatever the market had that day. He ate with the window open, letting the cool air move through the house. The sound of crickets filled the dark, steady and grounding. The solitude did not weigh on him, it steadied him. One evening his eldest son came to visit. The cottage smelled faintly of cedar, the fire crackling low in the hearth. The son looked around, eyes full of worry. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you lonely here?" Robert shook his head. "Lonely is when you're surrounded by people who don't see you. Here I'm seen enough by myself." The words settled between them, soft but certain. His son nodded slowly, his shoulders easing. They shared bread and soup, spoke of small things, weather, work, the house the children now called theirs. When his son left, Robert stood on the porch again, watching taillights disappear down the road. The night wrapped around him like a blanket. He thought often of his wife, not with bitterness, but with distance. Her voice no longer echoed in his mind. Her laugh, sharp and hollow, had faded into memory like a sound carried away by wind. He did not carry her with him. He carried only what mattered, the faces of his children, the proof of their loyalty, the peace of knowing he had given them something unshakable. On his final walk of that season, as leaves turned amber and fell crisp beneath his boots, he stopped at the edge of a field. The horizon stretched wide, the air filled with the smell of dry grass and earth. He breathed deep, filling his chest until it ached with life. There was no applause, no audience, no grand moment, only the quiet truth: he had done what he came to do, and now at last he was free to live the rest of his days not as a man tested, not as a man judged, but as a man at peace. The story of Robert does not end in the cottage, nor in the new house filled with children's laughter. It continues here, where you are listening, where you are watching, where the quiet of his journey now rests in your hands. He was a man who gave without asking, who tested not with anger but with patience, who hid his fortune not for greed but for protection. And in the end, he did not claim victory with thunder or pride. He claimed it with silence, with the peace of walking away, with the knowledge that those who loved him stood by his side, and those who scorned him were left with only their own echoes. The image lingers. A father closing the door behind him, keys passed to his children, his hands empty but his heart unburdened. It lingers because it is more than his story. It asks something of us. If you look closely, perhaps you'll see pieces of your own family in his steps. Maybe you remember a father who worked too many hours, hands rough, clothes worn, never once asking for applause. Maybe you remember a mother who bent herself small so her children could stand tall. Maybe you've watched someone you love give until there was nothing left to give, yet still be taken for granted. And maybe you've wondered, as Robert must have wondered, where love ends and where loyalty begins. So let me ask you now, the same question his story leaves behind. If it were you, if the people closest to you dismissed your worth, mocked your silence, waited like wolves for what you owned, what would you do? Would you forgive? Would you still open your hands, risking the same wounds again? Or would you walk away, closing the door not in anger but in dignity? Robert chose the second path. He chose to leave behind not bitterness but clarity. He chose to turn betrayal into protection. He chose to turn whispers into written truth. And he chose to give his fortune not to those who sought to exploit him, but to those who stood near him in love. His wealth was not the papers, not the deeds, not the accounts sealed with ink. His wealth was his children's faith. His wealth was the house alive with laughter. His wealth was the freedom to breathe in the dawn air without shame. But your story, your answer may be different. Perhaps you would have stayed, hoping time would soften hearts. Perhaps you would have fought louder, demanded recognition, refused to be overlooked. Or perhaps, like Robert, you would have stepped away, taking only what could never be stolen, your peace, your dignity, your truth. So here is the question that belongs to you. If your child or your partner or someone you trusted deeply betrayed you, would you forgive or would you walk away forever? Sit with that question. Don't rush it, because the answer reveals not only what you think of Robert's story, it reveals what you believe about family, loyalty, and love itself. And maybe that's why his story matters. Because in the end, it isn't about one man with a notebook and a hidden fortune. It's about every man, every woman who has ever wondered if the love they give will be returned. So tonight, as you close this story, look around your own table. Look at the faces who sit near you. Listen to the voices who speak in your home. Ask yourself, if everything else were stripped away, if the money vanished, if the fortune crumbled, who would still be there? That answer is your inheritance. That answer is your truth. Robert's story has been told. His questions have been asked. Now they belong to you. And before we part, let me say this. Thank you. Thank you for staying with me through every chapter, for lending your heart to this journey, for walking beside Robert when others turned away. If his story touched you, if it made you reflect on your own family, your own choices, then I ask you to carry it forward. Share it. Speak it. Let it be a reminder that respect is not optional, that love must be chosen every day. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, stories of family, of sacrifice, of betrayal and redemption, please subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. I wish you health, I wish you peace, and most of all, I wish you the kind of family that Robert longed for. One that sees you, respects you, and holds you not for what you have, but for who you are. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. And may your home always be filled with love.